I have a few points of club business to go over before we begin tonight's event. First and foremost, I'm going to start with the big one. You guys are going to get a sneak preview into our gala this year, our 111th annual gala, the big 111. We managed to secure Cipriani Wall Street downtown for the event this year. That is the largest freestanding ballroom in the city of New York. We're very honored to be having our 111th annual gala there. You may have remembered last year's gala was a massive success. We're expecting, 600-700 people, black tie affair, multi-course meal, open bar, and a lot of great conservative and populist speakers. So I'm very excited to be announcing that formally on Wednesday, but you all get the sneak preview, and we will be having tickets available for purchase very soon. I want to reiterate, if you would like some very nice Hungarian white wine, it is available for free, courtesy of the club. Just ask our fantastic bartenders in the back for a glass. I cannot pronounce it, I'm very sorry, but it is delicious. I can attest to the quality of the Hungarian wine. A few other matters. After the event's conclusion, the 2M pub on the 2M floor will be open for dinner and for drinks. I highly encourage you to go down and support our friends at the Women's National Republican Club. They're always great hosts. I see the vice president and the president in the back. Thank you, guys. We will certainly be sending our business your way.
And we will buy a table at your event.
I hope so, because I was going to chase you down for it if you didn't. So I'm glad to hear you came out ahead of the curve there. I know we have a lot of non-members at this event this evening because we were partnered with the Least Institute and the MCC Press. We have obviously many Hungarian Americans here as well. I will highly encourage you to join the club. We're the oldest and largest young Republican club in the country. Membership starts at $75 a year. You get access to free events like this, a lot of other exclusives and goodies, and it's very cheap in terms of dues. 1,200 members strong and growing. We have a clubhouse in Midtown. We'd love to have you come to many of our upcoming events, and I just want to list a few of them for you so you have an understanding of our lineup going forward. Here at the WNRC, we're going to be hosting Carrie Lake and Greg Kelly on the 29th, I believe. It's a Saturday, different type of event for us at 5 o'clock. Greg Kelly will have copies of his book. Carrie Lake will be speaking on a whole variety of matters, so it should be a good time. Tickets are going fast, so definitely get a ticket while you still can. And again, it'll be here at the WNRC on the 29th. We also have a Parkinson's Unity Walk this Saturday in Central Park, raising money and awareness for Parkinson's, being led by our philanthropy committee. If you're interested in that, please email philanthropy@nyyrc.com to our chairman, Jude Sumfun. And then we have some fun events as well, leading off on that. Margarita Monday, a little less serious, but we love our margaritas. That's going to be at the clubhouse with our Tommy Bahama machine. And we also have our Cinco de Mayo party coming up in May. In addition to that, I want to bleed into sort of the theme this evening. The club has been on the forefront of building relationships across the Atlantic, across the pond, with our conservative Hungarian friends. Hungary, as many of you may know, has been a leading bastion of conservatism, national conservatism, populism, whatever term you want to use for this past several years. And Hungary has proven that not only can a conservative or populist government win elections with very strong mandates, they can also go on to actually effectuate policy both domestically and internationally. So I think many in the conservative movement and across the world, frankly, both in the U.S. and internationally, see Hungary and the Orbán government as a leading example of what we can achieve if we have the right minds at the table and we are working towards a common goal, a national consensus, and all the rest. And the club has been honored to be at the forefront of fostering some of those ties. I spoke at the inaugural CPAC Hungary last year in Budapest. I'm honored to be re-invited and be speaking again in 2 weeks in Budapest with a whole great crowd of other conservative thinkers and activists. This club endorsed Viktor Orbán for re-election. He won massively, not because of the club, but we got that endorsement out. And some of you also may know the club has a long history of relations with Hungary. In the 1950s, this club actually had a committee for Hungarian refugee relief, and we hosted a 5,000-person rally at the old Madison Square Garden to raise money and support for many Hungarian refugees fleeing the violent communist revolution. Thank you.
Now we have the way back.
Now it's the other way around, and I've been promised refugee status if I need it. I can't extend the same to you all, but the club has had a long history of working with our Hungarian compatriots, ideological compatriots, and this is very important. We cannot be parochial in our outlook. We need to be able to look across the world. We look at the United States as, laboratories of democracy. Well, that applies to all of these sovereign nation states, and we are seeing successes in mainland Europe with the Orbán government in Hungary achieving massive results, whether it's fighting back against the demographic cliff with their pro-natalist policies, whether it's standing up for traditional Western Judeo-Christian values, whether it's promoting a foreign policy that actually makes sense and isn't just driven by ideology rather than the actual concerns and needs of its people. These are all things we can replicate in the U.S. at the federal level and, of course, at the state level where we control most governments currently, but maybe we'll control the federal government soon enough. This relationship wouldn't have been possible without our good friends at the Center for Fundamental Rights, led by Miklos Sántho, their Director General. It's an interesting title, but he is the Director General, and he has been very gracious with the club and his invitations to many of our members in fostering this relationship further. But with that said, I want to get into tonight's event. The way it'll be structured is our distinguished guest for the evening will be speaking. I'll be introducing him shortly. Following his speech, there'll be a very, very brief intermission while we reset this up, and we are going to have a panel with several leading populist and conservative thinkers. This will be moderated by another distinguished guest that I will be announcing. I'll keep everyone on their toes, and it should be a great time. We'll open it up at the end for some Q&A as well, but it should be a fantastic discussion. I'm looking forward to it. But with that said, I want to lead into tonight's speaker, who I had the pleasure of just meeting this evening, Mr. Orbán. I'm sure some of you may have been confused, but it's a common name. Mr. Balázs Orbán, who currently serves as the political director for Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's government in Hungary. He is the author of books that we have available in the back entitled The Hungarian Way of Strategy. He's a member of the parliament, he's a Hungarian lawyer, he's a political scientist, he's a philosopher, and he's really leading the broader ideological movement and this revolution that we're seeing in Hungary. He's at the forefront of that, articulating the policy positions, articulating the philosophy and the views behind government action that we're seeing on behalf of the Orbán administration. He's paving a way forward in Hungary. He has a very active Twitter where you can also follow him, where he comments on a whole variety of both Hungarian and U.S. political affairs. I think he's brilliant. I'm very honored to have him here today, and I want everyone to give him a warm New York welcome to Mr. Balázs Orbán.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege for me to speak to you at this event, generously hosted by the New York Young Republican Club and the List Institute. I can remember the first time I visited New York. We were just talking about it. It was at the beginning of the 2000s. All I could read about how the city was struggling with dirty streets, drug use, high crime rates. This was during Giuliani and then Bloomberg's term of mayor, and I had been prepared for the worst, really, when I first came to New York. But when I visited, all I saw instead was the city was clean, prosperous, vibrant, and full of life. So I drew three lessons from this. One is that political leadership does matter. The second, you cannot trust the mainstream media. And the third, and most important, that if you want to know something, you should go and see it for yourself. So this is the reason why I'm very grateful to be with you today here in New York, joined with my friends, Heather, Sora, Bladen, and Will, to have a discussion on how things are in Hungary and in the United States. The organizers asked me to talk about briefly about the book Hungarian Way of Strategy. That's nice of you, you might say, but why on earth would be a Hungarian way of strategy relevant to us Americans? So we need an American way of strategy. So return when you have something to say about that. We Americans prefer not to let strategic issues to go away from our hands. And this is, of course, makes sense. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we really do face similar problems, and therefore there are overlapping points between Hungarian and American strategies. Today I will be talking about these issues. Before we dive in, the first question we have to answer, of course, is what is a strategy? Why do we need it, and how does it help us? In my book, I use a joke to illustrate my point. This is the joke. A group of mice go to the owl, who is a well-known strategic expert in the animal kingdom. Hey owl, we have got a problem. Everyone's picking on us, and we can't defend ourselves. We have had enough. What should we do? The owl responds, well, why don't you turn into hedgehogs? No one messes with them. Oh, okay, that's interesting. But how do we become hedgehogs? The mice ask. The owl replies, how should I know? I only deal with strategy. So I like this joke because it shows that just having an idea is not a strategy. It has to be relevant. It has to be applicable. In recent years, the word strategy has been overused. It is used to describe everything from a vague intention to a mere set of values. We see examples of absurd ways in which strategy has been used, such as hairstyle strategy or toothbrushing strategy, leading to confusion and the lack of clarity in the decision making. The word strategy is often used when the content is not a strategy at all. In my book, I take a more conservative approach to the term, defining it as a set of concrete goals and detailed plan for action to achieve them. I examined Hungarian history and focused on when we Hungarians are, as a nation, were successful. I extracted the motives and the principles that played a key role in that kind of success. Times are of course changing, new technologies arise, but some things remain constant. Our identity and main principles that guide our actions, they don't change. We need to know why we were successful in the past and then reinforce them. We should not forget, but rather reinforce it. The book tries to highlight these and strengthen if we want to be successful and move things into the right direction. We need to hold on these stories and experiences. So when I finished, I figured out 6 main traits of the Hungarian people and 19 principles we should always keep in mind when making decisions and strategies. But really don't worry, I won't list all of them. It doesn't take too much insight to know that the internal dynamism of the Carpathian Basin, it's obviously not very relevant in the American context. But there are 4 principles that might be interesting for you as well, which could help us to navigate in contemporary ideological battles. The first principle is the following. An individual can only exist as a member of a community. The individual helps the community and gets support from it in difficult times. Being part of the community is essential for human existence. Communities make nations and states strong from the bottom up. They support their members who also help and complement each other. The second principle, family is the smallest natural community. In the Western civilization, Christianity brought us the idea of equality between man and woman, which does not mean that men and women are the same. Family life is part of private life, so it's not the government's job to interfere in family matters, but the government should protect important institutions like marriage between a man and woman and the child's right to have a mother and a father. The government should incentivize those who raise children, which is also the principle that the successful Hungarian family policy is based on. These principles, extracted from Hungarian history, play an important role in today's political debates in the entire Western civilization. Unfortunately, we see today that both sides of the Atlantic, that the institution of family is under attack. The progressive forces, they want to undermine the institution of family by emptying family roles, deconstruction, the concept of family, and spreading LGBTQ whatsoever propaganda aimed to children. If you want your nations to thrive and for the US and Hungary to be successful, you have to take a joint stance against these progressive ideologies. The third principle, the nation is the largest natural community based on shared identity. The identity is based on personal and family connections as well as a common history, culture, and the country. National identity can come from common ancestry, cultural ties, or citizenship. The nation is the highest level of natural and political community that an individual can experience as a member of the group with its own identity. Today, we see that the idea of a nation is under attack from at least two sides. Probably it's even more, but we experience two. First, by mass illegal migration that threaten our common identity, history, culture from the outside. Secondly, by the means of identity politics, namely, as you call it, the woke movement from inside, which actually wants to dismember the common identity of the nation, eliminating solidarity between the members of our nations. Actually, we don't have a word in Hungarian, so we also use the word woke, which is probably the only English-based political words what we have right now, but it shows clearly the resistance of a Hungarian language on that issue. This whole woke movement leads to a disappearance and disintegration of the nation as a political community. So conservative forces must do whatever they can to fight these phenomena. Otherwise, the nation we live in will be lost. This is why Hungary opposes illegal immigration from the beginning and combat identity politics on national and international level. The fourth principle is that it's the responsibility of states to serve and represent the interest of the communities, including the nation and the family, both in domestic and foreign policy. Today we see the rise of voices in international politics that argue that nation states should be integrated into a supranational, global, or even an international bloc-based government. As Hungarians, we believe this is a flawed idea and leads to dangerous trends, shifting the focus of foreign policy from representing the national interest to representing some liberal interventionalist idea. This is a phenomenon that we often face, pushed by the American current administration and the American ambassador in Budapest. Instead of building bridges, he comments on Hungary's domestic policy on regular basis, criticizing governments, promoting LGBTQ activism. A few months ago, this is a very interesting story. A few months ago, Hungarian Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Zsolt Semjén said, I quote, that in his view, the duty of universities should be seek, discover, and convey through truths, adding that this is particularly important when looking at universities in other countries, like in the United States, and the neo-pagan and barbaric ideology is getting more and more popular, denying the values that humanity was created. This quote might be a controversial claim, and we can of course have a debate about it, but I'm turning to you. No, please raise your hands if you think that there is something in it. Is there something in it, in that kind of quote? I think there is. You may like it or not. It is undeniably that large part, or at least a kind of majority of Americans would agree with the Hungarian Deputy Prime Minister's claim that the that the duty of the universities should be to seek, discover, and convey truths, not doing something else. So, and you know what the US ambassador and US administration has to say about it? Who did he compare the Hungarian deputy prime minister on the Twitter video published on an official account of the US embassy? You guessed it, Vladimir Putin. We see, so if you think that, you are Vladimir Putin's closest friend. We see that the United States as our friend. Friends do not have to agree on everything, but the good friendship is always based on mutual respect. With this foreign policy and confrontative strategy, the United States will not be able to keep and strengthen relations with other countries. On the contrary. Okay, but what can be the solution? It's easy. Ditch the liberal ideology. Represent your national interest. And the most effective way to do this is by pursuing the base of international order on voluntary cooperation of free and independent nations. We must not allow the world to be divided into hostile blocks of dependent nations as it threatens today. This goes against the interest of Western civilization. The West continues to take the military lead, which gives us confidence. But non-Western countries are already in competition with us in terms of technology and economy, and already has an advantage in demography and natural resources. If the Western world closes itself to bloc formation, it will isolate itself and harm its own chances of success. The cooperation of free nations has made the West great. We should continue to stick to it in the future. So, dear friends, people say that there are two rules of success. First, don't tell all you know, and I won't tell you the second. Well, it seems I failed in this sense by writing the book, but I don't mind, because at least this gave us the opportunity to come together today and have such a wonderful evening. I would like to thank again the List Institution, as well as the oldest and largest Republican club in the United States, great friend of Hungary, the New York Young Republican Club, for putting this together. I am humbled by so many of you joining us tonight instead of enjoying the wonderful spring weather in New York. Thank you very much to all of you. I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orbán. I'm going to ask everyone to give us a brief moment for us to set up for the next stage of the event. You can grab some drinks, run to the bathroom. It'll take us a few minutes, and we'll be having our panel discussion momentarily. Thank you again.
So many of the, I'll ask roughly each panelist one or two questions. They'll play around with those ideas for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we'll go to question Q&A. And if you know any of my work at all, you realize that the questions I'm asking the panelists don't necessarily reflect my own views, but I'm asking them sharp questions to foster interesting conversation, because otherwise if I ask them just softballs, you would be bored. So, starting with Balázs, as you know, there's a great deal of pressure on Ukraine over, I apologize, on Hungary over its response to the Ukraine crisis. There's not just from Brussels, but especially from Washington, this sense that Hungary is not fully on board with the program of escalation over Ukraine. You aren't prepared to send arms directly to Ukraine, although you've hosted many refugees. You're not going the whole hog as some of your neighbors are, as it were. So the question is, do your critics in Washington and Brussels have a point, given the fact that Hungary chose to join these alliances? It's not like you were forced into it. It was seen as a welcome development when you joined NATO, and now NATO is knocking and saying, hey, we need your full commitment on Ukraine. What do you say to a critique like that?
The situation is not easy, but I think the law is on our side. So according to our understanding, the NATO is not an attacking organization, but it's a defense organization. And none of the NATO countries are under attack. So if we are not following the hawkish agenda, it has nothing to do with the NATO membership, which has obviously another purpose. And the same with the EU membership. According to our understanding, EU memberships, it is about being part of, being a member of the community, which is about economic cooperation, some kind of political cooperation, but it has nothing to do with military. It has nothing to do outside support, nothing to do with foreign policy. So with the nation states and the nations of Europe, they did not give up their own foreign policy. Hungary would never sign up for this kind of alliance structure. I mean, I think for a country to have an independent foreign policy, this is the cornerstone of sovereignty. If you don't have your independent foreign policy, then what do you have? Nothing, actually. So, but the situation is not easy. We follow it very closely. We are a neighboring country. As you mentioned, we had more than 1.5 million border crossings from Ukraine, and we hosting everybody in a very good way. Hungary is actually in a unique position currently because we are hosting refugees from our eastern borders. Meanwhile, we have a border control and a huge border protection system on our southern borders to keep the illegal migrants out. So we were accused after the migration wave in 2015 that we cannot differentiate between refugees and illegal migrants. My message is that we can, and it's possible to differentiate. So those who are fleeing from war, mainly children and women, they are refugees, and you have a humanitarian obligation to host them if they are coming from the neighboring country. So meanwhile, those who are coming from different parts of the world, like from sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia and the Middle East, they are people who have problems, but definitely they don't have the right to cross illegally the borders. If they're trying to do so, there should be a Hungarian way of protection, which is pushing them back. So in this geopolitical situation, Hungary is in a special position. According to the war, I think there will be no winner of this war. There will be no winner of this war. And if we want to save lives, which is, according to our understanding, the most important principle, because many people, hundreds and hundreds of people on both sides are dying on a daily basis, and millions of people are suffering. So if you want to save lives, then you have to work on the peace, not the other way around, fuel the conflict and put more military resource and energy into that. It's a controversial issue. I think the majority of the world, I would say, it's behind us, but obviously the Western world is on the other side. So the majority of the Western world is trying to, or at least they are risking the potential escalation of the war, which is not a joke from our perspective. Many politicians are talking seriously about the potential nuclear escalation of the war. I was born in 1986. That was the time when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was blown up, and I cannot remember, but from the family memories, I do remember that for like 1 year I couldn't eat any fruit and vegetable which was produced in Hungary because of that nuclear power plant catastrophe. So we do understand what does it mean if something nuclear is blowing up in the current territory of Ukraine, and we don't want to see it again. This is the reason why we have a very strong pro-peace position, which is about ceasefire first, and then sit down, start negotiations. It's going to be very hard. It's going to take a long time, but at the end of it, the new security umbrella between United States and Russia, Europe and Russia should be created, because otherwise this tension will remain. So this is the Hungarian position. We are under heavy attack on that. As you can imagine, we are immediately pro-Putin's position and so on. We are accused by the worst things you can imagine, but this is how it goes. All the conflicts are ending with peace talks and negotiations. So the time and history is on the Hungarian side. We just have to wait and survive until that.
So, one more for you, Balázs, before I turn to Will and I know Prime Minister Orbán has described the conflict in Ukraine as a conflict between two Slavic countries, whereas here in the United States and across many other Western capitals, it's described as a battle between freedom and unfreedom, democracy and dictatorship. I've used the phrase that it's a war between two Slavic countries to my detriment in terms of people getting mad at me on Twitter. But I think it's the right approach. But can you distinguish the Hungarian reading of the conflict and why it's important not to ideologize the conflict the way the West has so far?
I would say two things. One is that this war it's not going on since 24th of February last year. It's going on since 2014. And if we after that, when back at the time the Europeans, mainly the Germans, were strong enough to create immediate ceasefire and to cool down the situation, that it became a frozen conflict. It was not solved with the long-term strategic agreement, but at least there were people were not dying in the same level as this is happening right now. So my first argumentation is just we have to be more brave, because there was the time when this conflict, the exact same conflict, was framed in a different way by the international audience. It's framed as a conflict between two Slavic nations. So it's not a nonsense idea to do so. The West made a decision that it changes the tone and turns it toward a more broader conflict, and it obviously we face the consequences. So if we want to change it back, then we have to change our position back to the original position, and then immediately the situation will be more nuanced. The other approach, it's a general approach, which I also wanted to touch or highlight in my speech, that the world is changing, and the unipolar world order is not anymore there. No one knows what will come, but everybody knows that something different is coming, and the United States and the West, it needs partners and alliance. So it does not make sense to divide the world to democracies and autocracies, and you can only be a democracy if you are 100% in line with the American foreign policy, and if you are not 100% in line with the American policy, you immediately become an autocrat. It does not make sense. And the same with the Hungarian foreign policy. So we need to collect partners through which we can represent our national interest, and it will require a very different way of thinking for Americans, for the entire West. And the first probe, so the first test or pilot project, was this conflict. And we went to completely opposite direction, where we created the bloc system, where we created the Chinese-Russian alliance backed by Indians and Brazilians and many other mid powers around the world. And I don't understand why this is a path which brings us to the bright future. So I think, and I encourage, as a Hungarian official, we Hungarians are encouraging the Western strategic decision makers to rethink it and restart this intellectual framing, which is necessary if we want to answer to the challenges of the 21st century. But we went into a dead-end street.
Will, we live in New York City, or I do, and as Balázs alluded to in his talk, it was a city that was once full of disorder, and then you had a courageous sequence of mayors and police chiefs who decided to confront not just big crimes, but little incursions on order. It's called broken windows policing. So that if you confront little incursions, you will also bolster the community's defense against big crimes like rape and murder. Isn't there an argument to be made, Will, that the international community is similar, that the US, since the end of World War II, and then especially after the Cold War, built a relatively decent global order, and that calls on us to be vigilant against little incursions like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the earlier invasion of Georgia? Strike back hard so that you prevent larger disorders from proliferating across the globe. That's certainly one theory that the Hawks put forward. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I just need to start out, since I work at a C3 organization and this is a Republican C4, that I don't do campaigns or electioneering in my role.
I was going to seek your endorsement for my
exactly.
gubernatorial run.
Look, we all have lawyers that tell us what we have to say. But I'm here to talk about foreign policy issues, and happy to do so in my private capacity. But to answer your question, the problem is, of course, is that you can't extrapolate from a domestic policing situation to think about the nature of the world. For one thing, public safety in a city is much more of a kind of seamless web of interest, because we work in the city. You go to the Yankee game. I'm a Red Sox fan. Sorry, but you go to the Yankee game. You have you're a part of a thick community. The international system is quite different, right? The international system is not a seamless web of interests. We have national interests. We have obligations. The state has an obligation to the members of its political community. And it's quite dangerous when one wants to take on a kind of policeman's role. It's quite costly, both in terms of potential blood and treasure. But I go back, and one of the things I liked about your book is that you start talking about strategy, right? And so you're asking a very particular question about this war, but I think that his book tells us to think about, with a strategiig mind. And with a strategic mind, you have to think about your ends, ways, and means. And when I think about the United States has an interest in its homeland security, right? Its territorial integrity. We have an interest in the conditions of our economic prosperity. And we have an interest in protecting our liberal democratic system here at home, a republican form of government, a constitutional order. And it's no embarrassment to say that means that a lot of things that happen abroad don't implicate American foreign policy interests, our national interests. And that means when it comes to the ways and means, that we have to adjust those ways and means relative to those ends. That's what being a good strategist is. We don't have a strategy for increasing the number of police officers, which is what you say in your book. You have a strategy for public safety. We don't have a strategy. We don't need a strategy for Ukraine. We need a strategy for protecting America's national interests. And the question is what we should do when it comes to Ukraine or even other parts of the world relative to those higher grand strategic goals. And I've said this many times, and I've also been hit for it, which is that Ukraine doesn't implicate in a very deep way American national interest, in particular because, to answer your question, there is no seamless web of interest, right? So for example, think about one of the most destructive wars of our lifetime. And most people don't know this, right? I used to be a professor, and I'd ask students, what's one of the biggest destructive conflicts of our age? Well, it's the conflict that had been happening in Central Africa. Well, they hadn't heard much about it for lots of reasons, but one of which is that it didn't implicate American national interest very deeply compared to, say, you know, our relationship with China or our relationship with our European allies and partners. So we have to be careful about assuming that every conflict everywhere is as important to us as it is admittedly to them, right? So I admire the bravery of the Ukrainians fighting for their country's kind of ancient liberties, right? Their independence. But that doesn't mean that my kids need to go fight there, right? Nor does it mean that we have to eliminate the reserves of our treasury, which we actually don't have because we're $31 trillion in debt, right? Yeah. So you have to calculate your interests and adjudicate your ends and means relative to those interests, taking into account the security environment, the threats to that security, and the nature of the world. And I could go on forever about how the nature of the world actually favors American restraint as opposed to a kind of liberal internationalist primacy. Part of that is because we have nuclear capabilities. We have a strong conventional deterrent, right? We have a strong military. We're far away from the rest of the world, and despite what Thomas Friedman says, like, distance still matters. It's hard to project power over large bodies of water. You know, the fact is the balance of power in Eurasia is pretty robust. Like, I mean, Russia has only proven in many of its problems on the battlefield that the idea of it getting to, you know, through the Fulda Gap or something is like it's like some type of like weird kind of boomer reminiscing about 1952 or something, right? So we live in a different world in some ways, right? It's not 1952 when the threat of the Soviet Union was so robust that we needed to do different things. But it's also similar to the history of mankind in that we have different interests as nations, as political communities, and that basic geographic factors like distance and so forth don't change. They still matter.
Glad. And France's President Macron recently indicated that he thinks the United States, that he thinks that Europe should not blindly follow the United States in strategic matters and should try to retain something of its strategic autonomy. What are the prospects for European strategic autonomy? And is it something that's desirable from an American point of view, since the last time Europeans were strategically autonomous, there was a bloodbath on the continent requiring massive US intervention and the creation of the post-war order? What do you make of the sort of prospects and value of something like European strategic autonomy?
It's a very good question. And I think the example that you pointed to indicates that a lot of actors on the global stage are starting to think, and not only think, but to make some early decisions and actions in a more strategic way. They are beginning to evaluate, after the changes of the last year, what the state of play is internationally with respect to their interests as they understand them. And so from an American standpoint, I think the first thing that the United States needs to do is to be aware that this is happening. Because for the last year, the United States has been kind of straddling the two different geopolitical worlds. A lot of the actions that the US has taken in the last year, sanctions regimes, for example, have clearly begun to cause all of these actors to evaluate their position. And that in turn has, many commentators now I think agree, it's becoming more of almost a bit of conventional wisdom in the commentariat, that the US has, through those actions and through the responses to them, the unipolar post-Cold War global liberal order is fracturing. So the U.S., I think, primarily needs to grasp that. When the Hungarian Way of Strategy came out at the end of 2021, I think it was almost like the quiet before the storm. It's like after COVID, before the formal breakout of the hostilities in 2022, at that time, Balázs made the statement in the book. What do people have to learn from, a small European country that has had a difficult time, defending itself over many centuries, but is so different in size and scale and scope from the American-led world order. And if you just step back even a few years ago in the American mind, there was really there was indeed no need to examine, what lots of other countries understood their interests to be. The assumption, and really the assumption of a lot of American policy in the last year, has been because of America's military might in Europe, America can essentially dictate the terms of European foreign policy. We don't have to, we don't have to worry too much about whether the major actors in Europe will start to diverge because they're not able to. Their scope of strategic action, to take the term from the book, is limited. But it's clear that because of the events of the last year, a lot of global actors, including especially Macron, to the extent that he speaks for others in Europe, perhaps those as well, now think that now is the time. Now is the time to reevaluate whether their strategic interests are being adequately served by just going along with the dictates that are coming out, or whether they need to reevaluate them. So it's very important for the U.S. to pay close attention to what the European actors are indicating there.
I'm just going to ask our hosts how much time we have. Gavin, do you know?
Another 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So we have probably time for about 2 questions from the audience. I'm sorry, that's not nearly enough. And I ask you, is that okay, Gavin? Is that,
Absolutely.
Yep.
And if they're good questions,
And I'm asking that you please just genuinely ask a question, and that it's an interrogative that ends with a question mark rather than a long.
And as he does that, I just want to say one quick thing about the question you asked, which is I think a lot of Americans underappreciate the advantages actually of European strategic autonomy, or the strategic autonomy of individual political communities in Europe. For the United States, for example, we had much different interests when it came to Libya than the Italians and the French and others. And this was a terrible war. It was a mistake. Terrorists flowed in, arms flowed out. It destabilized Mali. It helped contribute to the refugee crisis. We should have stayed the hell out of it. We got chain ganged into it. If the Europeans want to pay the blood and treasure to actually do things like Libya, then we don't have to be part of that. And it would be good for them to take the lead on those issues, or to have their own inner debate within Europe about whether they should be doing those things. So we underrate the value of just
give a battalion to Bernard Henri Lévy, just for himself to command.
No, but it's true that there is this kind of grumbling in the American attitude toward European strategic might, right? I mean, Americans in Washington are always complaining that about European countries not meeting their sufficient military and spending obligations. On the other hand, if they did that, well, I mean, their awakening of their own strategic interests would come along with it. So they should watch out what they call for.
Sorry, a kind of a discussion started. So, but and I have to defend the Americans against you, the Americans. So and I will play that role because the Americans currently are providing security for Europe, and it has a price. No one likes it, but this is the reality. If we in Hungary are attacked, by anybody, then American soldiers should come to Hungary and fight together with the Hungarian ones and defend the territory of Hungary. And the other way around, if America is attacked by Canada or I don't know who, then Hungarian soldiers should come and defend America. So this is what NATO means, but it has a price. If the security for Europe is provided by Americans, by American soldiers, by American money, but American power projection, then it has a price. So this is the reason why what was suggested by President Trump, it wasn't insane when he was talking about that the NATO requirement is saying that you should spend at least 2% of your budget to increase military capacities to be able to defend yourself, because I will be not there to protect you for eternity. You should do that. I think it was a very wise foreign policy, and the Europeans, I hope that the Europeans, not only the Poles, but the Europeans in general, they learned that lesson after the Ukrainian crisis. If you want to have your independent foreign policy, which means that you want to work together with your American partners, but an independent one, then you need to have hard power. You need to be able to protect yourself, and that's why I'm very proud that we Hungarians, we started way before our military modernization program, way before the conflict came, and this year we are at 2%, last year also 2%, so we are coming up because we don't want to be dependent on the Americans. And I think it's not against America, it's a pro-American policy not to be dependent on hard power on the Americans.
Let me add one thing on this, which is you made an important point about the difference between the defense of Europe and going out of area. And there were people who claimed that NATO would die if it would go out of business if we didn't go out of area. And that was a big mistake. Because solidifying the Western alliance and defending it the way you're talking about is relatively easy compared to doing Libya, Afghanistan, or Ukraine. And so I think we have to make those distinctions between what we do together within NATO versus what we want to do outside of it to try to bring the New World Order abroad.
And also in the context of Macron's statements was not a full return to Gaullist withdrawal, French instincts to withdraw from NATO or anything like it. It really wasn't so much about the European context. It was about Taiwan and the role that Europe could play in potentially, I don't know exactly how one would choose to analyze it, but it wasn't just it wasn't a statement about really the relationship between the U.S. and European Union countries militarily in Europe, but about whether Europe should allow its own economic interests to be sacrificed for the U.S.'s some Americans' interpretation of their military interest in Taiwan. And it remains to be seen what power or what's in the back of Macron's mind. What does he think that he or Europe would be able to do? But as a simple matter of calculating fact, the U.S. would have to take into consideration that in the event of a military conflict with Taiwan, some Europeans might have a different view economically.
One or two questions? Yes.
Good evening. My name is Meg Hansen. I'm the former president of the Ethan Allen Institute in Vermont. And looking at a state like Vermont, as most of you know, that's descended into complete totalitarianism from the far, far left. In the field of arts, for example, or culture, the monopoly is complete. Fashion, film, poetry, it's all about very far left, progressive, ideological activism. And we see to a point where everything that is grotesque and malignant is elevated. and beauty is destroyed. In Hungary, so my question is for Mr. Orbán, there has been government interventions into the cultural sphere, which has really shocked and upset the Western media, the mainstream media, which is sort of, left wing. While they might do it here, that's fine, but if anything else happens, it's a big problem. So, of course, I support it. I think it's great. Could you please speak more about, that the strategical way of intervening in like theater, fashion, film in that area? Thank you.
Actually, you touched one of the hardest points, because I think it's even harder than geopolitics, because it's culture, and what our experience is in Hungary, that although the people on general elections, they do support the right-wing government, and their requirement is very obvious, that they are supportive towards us because we are representing conservative values, and they want to see these values during the government. And we could create some economic success, which is also important for them. So from the political point of view and economical point of view, it's just these are the basic elements of being a successful government. But in the field of culture, it's what we experience in Hungary. It's very similar to what we have here in the United States. So we are part of the Western civilization, and these cultural trends from Netflix and from the international media platforms, these are coming. I mean, and we have to respond to that somehow. What we did, I mentioned during my speech the woke issue, and when we first started to talk about woke, this ideology and LGBTQ issues, you can imagine a grassroots Hungarian has no idea what woke means. I mean, they for like months they did think that we are talking about Vogue, which is the French magazine. So it's what does it mean to be transgender, and why it has to be shared with my children in the kindergarten. So it was really something, a nonsense, which was far away. And the same happened with the migration crisis, and the same happened with all the identity political issues. And what we did is that, and what we realized that we have to tell the people that it's coming, like this type of winter is coming, and it's gonna reach us, and we have to have a response, or a joint response. I mean, a community-based, a nation-based response on that before it is becoming part of our everyday life. And that's why we made referendums in connection with migration, in connection with the gender issue, and there was a big political debate and constitutional debate as well in Hungary about whether we should have sexual orientation for children in the kindergarten. And whole majority, 95% of the Hungarians during a referendum said no. So right now, what I can say as a state and as a government, that it's not part of the political debate anymore, because there is a constitutionally binding decision on that. So what my duty is as a government is not to tell or do what I think it should be done, but the other way around, follow the order of the people, which became very obvious after the referendum. So, and it gives us a maneuvering space and a safe space as well, which is required for conservatives also, not only for liberals. This is one thing. And the other thing is that the state should actively playing a role in having a level of playing field, so an equal playing field for everybody. It cannot happen that only liberal agendas are there. It cannot happen. If if it happens by nature because of the dominance on the cultural sphere, or on the educational sphere, on the media sphere, then the state should actively be involved to counterbalance it and to create an equilibrium. It's not about creating a dominance on the other side, but creating an equilibrium, which is crucial if you want to maintain pluralist democratic parliamentary system. So, and this is something which is for a Hungarian, it comes it comes very naturally. I can imagine that for an American, it's hard because, and especially for an American conservative, because the Reaganian type of thinking, it's completely different. You know, state should not be involved in these issues, but things change, and liberals, they are not anymore on board with us to maintain this kind of pluralistic system. They want to have dominance, so the state should act different and should be involved and defense democracy and equilibrium of opinions in the cultural sphere as well. This is the only way. Otherwise, it's the battle is lost.
Another question?
Yeah, and one thing I would add on the American context is whether you're a libertarian or you're a conservative or a NatCon, there's no reason why, when we're building public buildings, that they can't represent something true, good, and beautiful in the design, right? I mean, we shouldn't allow our public buildings to be built according to the kind of liberal fashions, as opposed to things that we know have staying power and represent our community in a way that gives us respect for our community and for the state.
Another question, guys? Do a man.
Okay. You know, as a Republican in New York, I've been accused of nationalism, populism. I feel tonight, you know, my view is localism. How do we get people to shift the discussion to thinking about what's good for my family, what's good for my neighborhood, right? You guys talked about community and nation as these different entities. If I say, what's good for the people on my street? Oh my God, you're a fascist, right? Oh, you're a bad person. No, I'm just like a gay Republican American weirdo living on my street. I want to do what's best for them. I want them to have good food. I want them to be free. I want the streets to be clean, right? I'm still a Christian, right? That's really a weird thought. How do we, the question is, how do we bring it home? And you guys have the same challenges abroad. How do we bring that home? And we have a media that's completely biased towards globalism. So if you contradict them, you're demonized. And even to my neighbors who are like big Biden supporters, how do we bring home the idea of like, what's good for our street?
Got it. So let me tackle this one. I think localism is very important. It's deep in the American tradition. But under modern conditions, in order to protect the local, the things that we cherish about the local, it actually, in some cases, requires us to act on the national scale. So for example, when you have large concentrations of technological and corporate power in something like big tech, you can't say, well, why can't we find a localist solution to that? Because my neighborhood, even though my neighborhood happens, it's like my zip code is 10022, it's probably more powerful than like a zip code in Montana or something. Nevertheless, even 10022 cannot overcome the power, like combined power of Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. And that's where the conservative thing, if you want to conserve local power pluralism, you actually need the state to countervail the power of corporate giants like, you know, Google, Facebook, etc. And there are other examples as well. So it's just not to say that localism isn't important. I think it's a great thing, but in some ways echo what Balázs said. Sometimes to protect precisely what's local requires sort of concerted national, in some cases global action.
Well, and then going back to the foreign policy part, I keep saying this. One of the reasons why we need to change our grand strategy in this country is because we have so many problems here at home. and we're not prioritizing those. And you know, when we spend hundreds of billions of dollars like we are on what are essentially oftentimes foreign adventurism, there is a trade-off. And people talk about walking and chewing gum at the same time, but what they really mean is they don't want to make trade-offs. And one thing that is a hallmark of conservatism is that we appreciate that there are real constraints in the world and real trade-offs. And our foreign policy has been taking the bandwidth of our national leadership, our budgets, and so forth, in a way that allows us to be decaying. I mean, I believe that we are in a situation of American decay. And we need to revive our country and our civil society. And we need to put more effort, and the money that we should spend at either the state, local, or national level needs to be privileged over what we're spending in Ukraine or down the road for Taiwan.
Hi, my name is Aluda. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I do want to bring it back to Ukraine a little bit. I have a two-part question. One, you have mentioned that you believe that negotiated solution is the only outcome to the Ukrainian conflict, but some would argue that there were attempts at a negotiated solution for the 2008 war in Georgia, the 2014 conflict in Ukraine. Do you believe it's possible to have a long-term sustainable negotiated solution with Putin without it appearing to be a policy of appeasement where he will continue his conquests? And the second part of that question is, what is a response to someone who would argue that containing Russia's military conquests in Europe is in the interests of NATO and the US, since Russia is a major military adversary to both of those entities? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think that it should be possible because this is the only chance. There is no other chance. I mean, until this moment, no one was ready to put together this kind of agreement. And this is the reason why my Prime Minister keeps talking about that this war should not be end with the Ukrainian-Russian talks. I mean, United States is needed. United States, European, Ukraine, and Russian talks. And no one knows whether others should be also involved, but these great powers should definitely be involved in the talks. And I think that the conflicts you mentioned, like Georgia and some other things, it showed us very clearly that if we are isolating the conflict, this is a short-term solution, which is much better than nothing, because never forget, than on a daily basis. So in Transcarpathia, there are ethnic Hungarians who are living there. They are Ukrainian citizens, and they are fighting on the front line. So actually, my fellow Hungarians are dying on the front line on a daily basis. So short-term solution is always better than no solution. But then we should work on with the United States closely together with the long-term solution. If the United States is not involved or want not to be involved in that kind of peace talks, then others will be involved. And then it will be part of the global competition between the big players. And the other part, I mean, I think the Russians are only understanding hard power. So they are hard power nations. So if you have the hard power, they have the hard power, then they treat you as equals and you can have a conversation with them. If not, then you are lost. There is an ongoing debate between us and the hawks in Europe. And the hawks are saying that they are saying always two arguments in the same sentence. And I keep telling them that, okay, I can accept I can accept the first argumentation and the second argumentation, but I cannot accept both because those argumentations are contradicting each other. First argumentation, Russia is too weak to conquer Ukraine. This is argumentation or statement one. The statement two is always in the same sentence, they use it, that Russia is threatening the entire Europe and NATO. And the world. You know, you can be hawkish. It's a legitimate position, but then you have to choose between these kind of argumentation. Either Russia is too weak to conquer Ukraine, this is the reason why we have to act, or Russia is a threat to the entire NATO, and this is the reason why we have to act. But the two things are contradicting each other. So all I want to say is that the current argumentation in favor of the war is full with contradiction. So we have to just slice it and stay on the rational side.
We'll do another question. Sorry, a lot of people want to ask.
This is really quick. The question for Balázs. Would you say that the Hungarian way of strategy is fully aligned with the multipolar strategy from Alexander Dugin, or it has some disagreements?
I think it only fits for Hungarians. So it had some elements, but the Russian and the Peruvian and the other way of thinking, it's definitely different. So because my idea is that you know, everybody, like, we were struggling for sovereignty for like 500 years. And if you are fighting for sovereignty, then you don't have strategic thinking, because then you have tactical thinking, how to survive and how to preserve what you have. And we regained our sovereignty after the Cold War, and then it took us for like 15 years to go into NATO and EU. And the question only 15 years ago came up, then what should we do now? What is the purpose of our existence now? And it is very hard to answer to that question. Probably it's not. It's very hard to explain it to the Americans, because America is in the most successful period, and it's 200 years of success, which was based on good strategic thinking and good strategic decision making. But and Russia, it has its own successful periods as well. Probably they made the strategic mistakes in connection with the war in Ukraine, but the previous 20 years was about an emerging Russian power. Now it's over, but they had their time. In the Hungarian case, it's really, we have to put energy into thinking about what should be done and how should we read our own history, our own geographical location. I mean, as you can imagine, the geographical location of Hungary is not as simple as the American one, which was explained, that we are far away from everything, and probably we are able to manage Canada and Mexico. So that if we are in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the plains, surrounded by Russians, Turks, German-speaking words, Slavic nations. So it's more complicated. We have to relearn what we experienced in the past and what we can have as a toolkit for the future. So that's the reason why I'm saying that what is in that book, it only fits for Hungarians. But I think, and my goal was to provocate a kind of an internal Hungarian debate on that issue. But at the end of the day, it turned out that it can be interesting for foreigners as well. So that's the reason why I'm here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
More?
My name is Kálmán Magyar. Thank you very much. I'm very impressed by the level of high thinking, strategic thinking of the panel. But my question is as follows. Is there any, as mostly to the American panelists, this question, is there any remote possibility, and we're talking about the Ukrainian situation, is there any remote possibility that the policy, the United States policy on Ukraine is shaped by personal interests as opposed to national interests?
We're all pointing at each other.
This job is not easy.
I mean, I'll let others think about this question, but just to add something, which is that I think one point it's important to get out in this panel, especially because we represent two different countries, is the importance of having a kind of strategic understanding or empathy. So for example, if the United States or France or the UK wants to push Hungary in a certain direction, it needs to, I think, be more appreciative of the particular situation that Hungary has, say, that's different than us or UK. I also think it's the same thing when it comes internationally. I mean, clearly Putin is the aggressor here, but I think that we oftentimes forgot how our intentions would be read abroad. In particular, all the way back to 2008, and some of the things that have been said about the NATO's open door. And I think this issue of NATO's open door is going to have to be part of the discussion about the peace, because while it wasn't necessarily a univariate cause of the conflict, NATO's open door was a contributing aspect of creating some of the challenges that we see today.
Thank you. Exactly.
Okay, I'll tackle the spicy question.
We want the spicy question
I'll
answers.
tackle the spicy
so
question. Look, I was at the New York Post when the Post published this story about our then illustrious vice presidential son, Hunter Biden, getting paid $83,000 a month, really nice work if you can get it, to serve on the board of Burisma, this Ukrainian energy company. Probably given his vast expertise in Eastern European energy affairs. That said, I actually don't think that that's the case. To be honest, ultimately, yes, Hunter Biden is kind of gross. In a way, it would be reassuring if, I don't know, the president or others in the White House were personally invested in Ukraine's famously transparent economy and politics. That would be sort of reassuring. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The people who are driving the sort of hawkish agenda, like Victoria Nuland and others, are genuinely fanatical about this idea of spreading democracy to the ends of the earth using U.S. arms, and they're ideologues. With the merely venal and corrupt, in a way you can deal. You can say, "Oh, you want this, we want that, okay, we'll come." But when you're dealing with ideologues, it's much more difficult to get them to come to terms with reality. So, as much as I wish it were as simple as Biden family corruption, I don't think that's what it is.
What about the $1 billion you're not going to get unless you fire the prosecutor? Okay.
Yeah, he's throwing his weight around, but I don't think that's what's driving U.S. policy in Ukraine. I wish it were that, again. That would be simpler.
Yeah, I mean, our task is going to be so much greater because the Washington establishment, which is also mirrored abroad, is so committed to this primacist grand strategic project. That's much harder to deal with than venal corruption.
Mere venality.
Yeah.
And I think the question around that now is that a purely value rational thing on behalf of the Washington liberal elite? Is it value rational, meaning they're so committed to that they're willing to sacrifice all of the consequences? Or is it also instrumentally helpful to them in some way? And I think we could say it has been instrumentally helpful to the US in some ways over the last year. I mean, the US has considerably strengthened its position within the West. So it's, short-term advantages have accrued to it. I mean, it has a considerable amount of power right now to boss around its allies and not get a huge amount of pushback. But it remains to be seen whether it's rational in the medium term and the long term. People are talking about the risk to the US dollar's reserve currency status. That's a story that is starting and yet to be written. And obviously, if the key feature of the liberal order is that it's global and then it becomes a kind of new form of liberal isolationism, that's not very compelling either. Why are people pursuing this in Washington? I don't have a magic answer to that, but my perspective and the way that I usually try to summarize it from my point of view is that I think there isn't actually just one decision maker right now making all of those decisions. There are a number of parties. There could be a mixture of personal interests. There are military interests. There are embedded ways of thinking that already exist. And then there is, even within the domestic sphere, you know, a lot of these people enjoy and exercise their power, you know, through lording over others their commitment to this crusade, right? It's a way that they exercise and maintain power at home as well. So I think that I think there are a number of different sectors, or a number of different actors or groups of actors that all have had an interest in this pretty clearly in the short term. There's even been a lot of you know, military technology that's been, you know, tested and developed and so on and so forth. So from a short-term perspective, there have been a lot of reasons for a lot of people to support this policy. But in the medium term and the long term, which America's not really thinking about enough, it's much more vexed.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.